The applause started before Elena Vale realized her name had been removed. At first, she thought she had simply missed it. The lights were warm, the room was full, the projection screens behind the stage glowed with gold lettering and polished gratitude. The Vale Museum of Civic Memory had spent 6 months promoting the opening of its most ambitious cultural restoration wing in decades, a project Elena had researched, designed, negotiated, salvaged, and carried through every political delay that should have killed it long before opening night. She knew every archive that had been saved, every donor who had nearly walked, every compromise that had cost her sleep, every room in that building that existed because she had refused to let it collapse under vanity and money and fashionable indifference. And yet, when the chairman stepped to the microphone and began thanking the people who had made this vision possible, her husband's name came before hers. Then came the board, then the city partners, then the donors, then her mother-in-law, then even the consultant who had arrived only 3 weeks earlier and spent most of his time making polished suggestions based on things Elena had already solved months before. Her name never came. She stood there anyway, smiling, still, elegant in deep blue silk beneath stage lighting that made everyone look more certain than they really were. Beside her, Adrian Vale accepted praise with the practiced humility of a man who had learned how to look gracious while absorbing work that wasn't his. And what Elena would remember later was not his expression. It was her own heartbeat. Because in that moment, something inside her did not shatter. It settled. That kind of settling can look like calm from the outside, but sometimes it is just the sound a soul makes when it finally stops begging to be recognized by people who were always more comfortable using it than honoring it. By the next morning, Adrian would no longer control the foundation wing everyone thought he had built. And Elena, the woman they had spent years describing as supportive, gifted, refined, patient, would begin, for the first time in her adult life, to act like someone who understood that patience and self-erasure were not the same virtue. But before I tell you how a woman spent years building legacy, marriage, and public meaning for people who had quietly learned to stand in front of her work, welcome to Luke's Hidden Stories, where love, power, and silence are never as simple as they seem. And this story isn't just about credit. It's about what happens when the person who has always made everything possible finally decides to stop making herself invisible. 3 months earlier, Elena Vale still believed that restraint could save a relationship. She was 36, brilliant without being loud about it. The kind of woman people described as graceful, when what they often meant was that she had learned how to remain composed while being underestimated. Before marriage had folded her into the Vale family orbit, Elena Navarro had been known in academic and civic circles for something much harder to fake than charm. She could see structure, not only in buildings, in people, in systems, in institutions, in the delicate, mostly invisible architecture that holds something up long after the people standing beneath it forget what keeps the ceiling from falling. That was why the museum project had become hers in all but public language. The Vale family liked to speak of it as legacy. Adrian liked to speak of it as expansion. His mother, Celeste Vale, liked to speak of it as stewardship. Elena saw the truth more clearly than any of them. Without real preservation work, the museum would become another polished civic vanity project. Expensive, shallow, politically useful, and spiritually empty. She refused to let that happen. So she did what she had done for years. She handled the difficult conversations nobody else wanted. She repaired donor fractures. She rebuilt the Academic Advisory Council after 2 key resignations. She persuaded skeptical city archivists not to pull their support. She reworked the restoration plan when budget optics threatened the entire collection. She found language that protected both meaning and money, which is one of the rarest forms of labor in wealthy institutions, because everyone wants both, but very few people know how to keep either from corrupting the other. Adrian admired this in private. At least, that was what Elena had once believed. When they were first married, he used to watch her work late in the study and say things like, "You see what everyone else misses." Back then, it sounded like love. Later, she would understand that admiration becomes dangerous when it lives inside someone who wants the results of your mind without ever growing comfortable with its authority. Adrian had not begun as a cruel man. That was part of the sadness. Cruelty is easier to leave. It gives shape to pain. It makes the injury visible. Adrian was subtler than that. He was attentive when it cost him nothing, proud of Elena when her brilliance reflected well on him, tender in the ways some men are tender with women whose strength they still believe they can frame as supporting material in the larger story of themselves. He did not try to destroy her. He simply kept accepting versions of the world where she became smaller and he became central. And the family around him helped. Celeste Vale, his mother, had built her whole life around polished influence. She never raised her voice when something sharper would do. She liked women who were elegant, useful, socially intelligent, and careful not to disrupt the emotional hierarchy of the room. In the early years, she praised Elena often. "Elena has such depth," she would say. "She brings soul to the family. She softens Adrian beautifully." Elena used to mistake those lines for affection. But compliments can also be cages when they only celebrate the parts of a woman that make everyone else's life smoother. The first time she noticed the pattern clearly was at a donor lunch 12 months before the museum opening. A city preservation grant had nearly fallen apart after a legal discrepancy surfaced in one of the advisory agreements. Elena caught it, corrected the structure, and personally salvaged the city partnership over 48 exhausting hours. At the lunch, one of the trustees congratulated Adrian on his strategic handling of the issue. Adrian laughed modestly and said, "Well, I try to stay ahead of fires before they spread." Elena waited, not because she needed a speech, not because she wanted public worship, just the small correction people make when they love you enough not to let your work be absorbed in front of you. He never made it. Later, in the car, she asked gently, "Why didn't you say I handled that?" Adrian kept his eyes on the road. "You know how those rooms are," he said. It wasn't the moment to complicate things. Complicate. That word stayed with her. Because women like Elena are often taught that asking for accurate acknowledgement is a form of emotional inconvenience. She did not fight then. She explained. That became her habit over the next several years. She explained when donors treated her as decorative. She explained when Adrian repeated her ideas later in meetings with a slightly deeper voice and received admiration for his strategic instincts. She explained when Celeste used phrases like, "Elena has such a gift for support," in rooms where Elena had done most of the intellectual lifting. She explained when people introduced her as Adrian's wife at events shaped by months of her own labor. And because she explained without screaming, without accusation, without spectacle, they slowly trained themselves to believe her pain must not be very serious. That is one of the quietest tragedies in certain kinds of relationships. If a woman is dignified enough in the way she tells the truth, people often assume the truth doesn't hurt that much. By the winter before the opening, Elena had become skilled at carrying contradictions that would have exhausted many people long before. She still loved Adrian, or at least, she loved the man she kept hoping he still wanted to become. She still respected the project, still believed the museum mattered, still believed that legacy should mean more than family branding wrapped around philanthropic performance. But she had begun noticing something colder beneath everything. When she spoke now, Adrian listened the way busy men listen to weather reports. Not dismissive exactly, just calm in that infuriating way people become calm when they have already decided your distress is less important than the smooth continuation of their own comfort. The shift became undeniable 6 weeks before opening night. Elena had spent days negotiating with a private donor family whose funding was tied to naming rights. The museum could not ethically grant without compromising the archival integrity of the restoration. She found a compromise that protected the collection and preserved the donation. At the strategy dinner that followed, a board member lifted his glass and said, "Adrian, I don't know how you keep all these moving pieces aligned." Adrian smiled. Celeste smiled too. And Elena, suddenly very still, watched the familiar pause enter the room. The pause in which truth could still be spoken if anyone loved it enough. Then Celeste said lightly, "Adrian has always known how to turn vision into loyalty." That line should not have wounded Elena as deeply as it did. But it wasn't only the theft. It was the intimacy of the theft, the family fluency, the way everyone at the table seemed to understand their roles in this little social ritual where a woman's labor became atmosphere and a man's presence became authorship. That night, Elena did not cry. She opened her laptop in the study and began quietly documenting everything. Not out of revenge, out of self-respect. Dates, emails, draft histories, archived proposals, funding revisions, advisory notes, recorded authorship trails, private correspondence that showed whose language had shaped the institution at every critical turn. She did it because something in her had finally begun to shift from emotional appeal to factual clarity. That is often the beginning of real transformation, not anger, accuracy. The moment she stopped asking, "Why don't they see me?" and started asking, "Why have I kept handing my reality to people who benefit from blurring it?" Still, the deepest turning point did not come from Adrian. It came from herself. A week before the opening, Elena visited the unfinished East Wing alone after hours. Most of the staff had gone home. The marble dust had settled. Protective coverings still lined part of the floor. The restored gallery lamps cast a soft amber light over cases that would soon hold letters, journals, and fragments of civic memory rescued from neglect. She stood in the center of the room she had fought for and felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in years. Grief. Not only for the marriage, for herself. For the intelligent younger woman who had mistaken being deeply needed for being deeply cherished. For every time she translated disrespect into stress. For every polished dinner where she made herself smaller to preserve the emotional temperature for others. For every achievement she softened so a man beside her would not feel threatened by the fact that she had built something real. People talk often about breaking points. They imagine them as loud, but Elena's came quietly, in a half-finished museum wing, under soft work lights, with no witness except the version of herself she could no longer betray. She whispered it aloud before she even realized she was speaking. "I'm allowed to exist in my own work." That sentence changed her more than any argument ever had. From that night forward, Elena stopped negotiating with the fantasy that recognition would come if she just phrased herself better. She did not become cruel. She did not become cold. She became exact. Opening night arrived with press, donors, city officials, and the kind of cultivated glamour that makes public life look elegant enough to conceal almost anything. Elena wore blue because Adrian once told her it made her look too serious to ignore. By then, she understood he had always meant it as both compliment and warning. And when the speech began, when her name failed to arrive, when the room applauded a story built from her labor and offered it back to her as spectacle, she felt the last illusion leave her body. After the ceremony, Adrian found her in the side gallery just off the reception hall. "There you are," he said softly, as if tonight had been a triumph they shared. "You disappeared." Elena looked at him for a long moment. "No," she said. "I think I was the only one standing exactly where I've always been." He gave the small laugh people give when they sense emotional danger, but still believe charm might flatten it. "Come on, Elena, not tonight." That line ended more than he understood, because "not tonight" is what people say when they want the comfort of your composure without the inconvenience of your truth. She did not raise her voice, did not accuse, did not ask one final time to be seen. She simply said, "You've had many nights protected by my silence. You won't be having this one." And then she walked past him. Not away from the marriage yet, toward herself. By morning, 3 things happened. First, the Museum Advisory Council received a complete authorship and governance record showing the full design, preservation, funding, and institutional history of the East Wing project, drafted carefully, factually, and with documentation no one could dismiss as emotional exaggeration. Second, 2 senior trustees who had trusted Elena's judgment for years requested an immediate review of public attribution, governance representation, and donor communications tied to the opening. Third, Elena informed Adrian that until the review was complete, she would no longer permit her work, language, or institutional relationships to be represented through him. He called her twice before noon, then 6 times by evening. When they finally spoke, his voice carried something she had not heard from him in years. Alarm. "Elena," he said, "you're turning this into something bigger than it needs to be." She stood in the museum's East Archive room, one hand resting on the glass case she had fought to preserve. "No," she said calmly. "I'm naming it at the size it always was." He tried tenderness. He tried frustration. He tried the old language of misunderstanding, timing, family pressure, optics, complexity. But once a woman has spent enough years translating pain for people committed to misunderstanding it, something powerful happens when she finally stops performing accessibility for those who only value it when it protects them. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said, and for the first time, Elena answered with the honesty she used to save for journals and sleepless nights. "That has never been the most important question," she said. "The most important question is why hurting me became so easy for you to live with." He had no real answer. Very few people do when they have built their comfort from someone else's repeated self-abandonment. The review became public in the soft, devastating way such things sometimes do. Not scandal, not spectacle. Correction. Credits amended. Public materials updated. Keynotes reissued. Press language revised. Authorship restored. Internal leadership roles clarified. Adrian was not ruined. That would have made the story simpler than life usually is. He remained respected, still polished, still connected, still capable of charming rooms that did not know how much had once been handed to him unfinished and made luminous by a woman standing just outside the center frame. But the old arrangement was over. Everyone knew it. Most of all, Elena. And that was the real ending. Not that she won, not that he lost, but that she no longer needed the room to correct itself before she allowed herself to believe what she had given. Months later, when visitors entered the East Wing, they passed a small plaque near the restored Civic Archive corridor. It carried the official dedication language, the revised leadership credits, and, tucked within formal wording most people would barely notice, Elena Vale's name in the place truth had always intended it to stand. Some people might think that would be enough, but what mattered more was who Elena had become by then. She moved differently, spoke more plainly, smiled without asking permission, stayed warm without becoming available for erasure. And when people praised her now, she no longer rushed to redirect the light somewhere safer. That is what real transformation often looks like, not hardness, self-possession, not revenge, alignment, not the destruction of everyone who failed you, just the end of your willingness to help them do it gracefully. If this story stayed with you, leave a like, subscribe to Luke's Hidden Stories, and tell me in the comments, what changes a person more in the end? The moment they are publicly overlooked, or the moment they finally decide they will never help hide it again? This is Luke's Hidden Stories. I'll see you in the next story.